My name is Paul Kudinaris. I'm a writer, I'm a photographer. I used to create art installations, one of which I live in now as my own home. I have a PhD in art history, and by reputation I'm something of a necrophile. By that I mean figuratively, not literally. I have a very large collection of taxidermied animals, and more importantly, I just completed a book which has been recently published called The Empire of Death. I had been traveling around in Central and Eastern Europe, and eventually I alighted at a hostel outside of Prague. One day I went to a local town called Melnik and found there a wonderful charnel house, one of the most fascinating places I had been to in the Czech Republic, not only because of its decor, which was highly elaborate, but also because there was absolutely no local interest in it, and I was the only visitor there for about 3 hours. When I came back to the hostel, I spoke to the man who worked at the desk, and he asked me where I had been that morning, and I told him I had gone to Melnik to a church decorated with human bones, and he said to me, no, that's in Sedlec. That's the famous bone church, the Sedlec ossuary. And I told him, yeah, I went to that one yesterday, but today I went to one in Melnik. And he told me, no, you're wrong, you're mistaken, you were in Sedlec. And he looked at me with this kind of pity that's reserved for lost tourists. So I decided to do a little research, not just on the charnel house in Melnik, but other nearby charnel houses which might still exist and be completely ignored. In the end, I wound up visiting and photographing over 70 charnels on 4 different continents, and in fact, I discovered multitudes more which once existed, and as I said, the basis of a project was formed that day in Melnik. Regarding the charnel houses, which I study in my book, they have their roots back in early Christian culture. The pagans, the Greeks and the Romans, preferred cremation as a form of burial, but the Christians, the early Christians, were interested in bodily burial mostly because they felt the body would be resurrected at some point in time, and not within an entire millennium, but the early Christians believed Christ would be returning fairly soon, so it was important to not cremate the body but to preserve the remains. They started utilizing especially the Roman catacombs. After 313 AD, with the Edict of Milan, church building publicly was legalized, and many Christians now wanted to be buried on church property. In fact, the term cemetery comes from an old term cematorium, which simply referred to a churchyard. Eventually, of course, these churchyards became so clogged with burials that new room had to be made. The body had to be dug up. It had to be charneled. The bones had to be preserved. The bones couldn't be discarded because those were the remains of our esteemed relatives and ancestors, and they needed to be kept on the churchyard in sacred ground. And so this gave rise to what are known as charnel houses, or in Latin, carnariums, places of the flesh. By the Middle Ages, a new movement began not just to store the bones in these charnel houses, but also to start displaying them as kind of memento moris. By the 16th and 17th century, there was a radical change in the approach to the display of the dead, and it gave way to what I call in my book the golden age of art in human bone. At this time, especially in the Catholic world, there was this penitent movement to not only mortify the human flesh, but to display the dead, not just to venerate them, but also as a means of contacting and doing service for the souls in purgatory. In writing this book, I had an agenda that was something more than simply writing an illustrated history of charnel houses. If you look at the history of the way people interpret death, and you look cross-culturally at how death is perceived, typically death has been considered a transition, not a terminus. Nowadays in our culture, death is a kind of border. But when death is viewed as a transition, which in fact historically is much more typical, death is a transition. It's just another way of life. It's possible for the dead to continue to have an important and meaningful role in society, a cultural role and a spiritual role, and still continue to play a part in the life of the living. In completing this book project, in an ironic way, I feel like I'm carrying on a family tradition. My grandfather, and before him, especially my great-grandfather, were in fact grave robbers. So, in some way, I think it's part of my family tradition to be wandering around and breaking into tombs.